While reading on the colony of Vancouver Island for a future video, I came across a few interesting anecdotes and histories that I feel are worth sharing, as they give a human face and character to the history of the short-lived colony. Vancouver Island was established as a colony in 1849, and Richard Blanshard was appointed governor and arrived on the island in 1850. Despite his royal appointment, he was not a respected authority figure, and he struggled much on the island. Schofield described his plight, and I quote from his book on British Columbia because I could not word it more perfectly. The governor found no residence awaiting him, not even apartments in the fort. He was therefore obliged during the first few weeks of his stay in the colony he had come to reside on board HMS Driver. Then he lodged in the fort, and afterwards a small house and office were built outside the stockade. Blanshard had seen service in the West Indian Islands, in British Honduras, and in India, where he had held position under the colonial office, and he was seemingly well qualified to govern an infant colony. But on Vancouver Island he found nothing to govern, because the Hudson's Bay Company, under the terms of the royal grant, managed affairs as it liked. And, it has been said, more in its own interest than in that of the settlers. It was most unlikely that an utter stranger, even though clothed with all the power that the Queen's Commission could give him, would be cordially welcomed by the representatives of the great monopoly, especially in view of the fact that Sir John Pelly had requested Earl Grey, Secretary of State for the Colonies, to appoint that representative, namely James Douglas, to the coveted position. The truth is that Blanshard was not wanted, and the Hudson's Bay Company soon made his position untenable. With high hope, he had set out to rule the new colony, where he had expected to be accorded the deference and respect due his rank, but his hope was rudely dashed to the ground. He found no public affairs to administer, no seat of government, no judiciary, and no legislature. There was little indeed he could do except regulate the disputes between the Hudson's Bay Company officers and their servants, which disputes were frequent enough. The governor received no salary. He accepted the position in the expectation that colonists would flock to the country, and that every inducement would be offered people to settle there, and that, of course, as the colony progressed, a civil list would be voted. He also expected that the sale of land and the royalties on coal would produce a considerable revenue, but these sources of income were controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company under the terms of the grant, and the monies so derived were expended by its officers. Despite the high hopes Blanshard had for the colony, it was far too remote, and the monopolistic Hudson's Bay Company had too tight a grasp on the island's affairs for a civil government to develop healthily. Schofield writes about another settler whose time on the colony was also frustrated by the company, and the high cost of land and the distance of that land from Fort Victoria. In fact, he was the first independent colonist on Vancouver Island, Walter Colquhoun Grant. Akrigg also writes of him, adding that he was over 6 feet tall and apparently had very little business sense. Schofield writes, Captain W.C. Grant, a retired Army officer, was the first independent settler to reach the island. He arrived on the Harpooner in 1849 and brought with him the first party of colonists under the system inaugurated by the company. The party consisted of 8 men. Captain Grant had been induced to take this step by the company's advertisement in the London Times. On his arrival, he found that all the land in the neighborhood of Victoria and Esquimalt had been placed under reserve. He was recommended to settle at Meteor, but not finding the land in that district desirable, he proceeded to Sook, and there, at a distance of 26 miles from Victoria, he settled down. He soon, however, grew tired of life in the wilderness, and a year or 2 later left the island in disgust. Grant would leave for the goldfields in southern Oregon, but would write about his experience in Vancouver Island from Oregon City on August 8, 1851. I was obliged to go 25 miles off, where I have been living a totally solitary life ever since. I soon got tired of my own society, and except when a stray ship came along the coast, never saw a creature save my own men and a few rascally Indians. I got quite weary of my existence, and if it had not been for the episode of a 2-month trip down to the Sandwich Islands last winter, I really believe I should have committed suicide by hanging, drowning, or otherwise. I returned from the islands with fresh vigor, but soon got disgusted again, saying that no other bona fide settlers were coming out to enliven my solitude. I truly believe it is hard to understate how isolated the island was in its infancy, at least for the British inhabitants. To really understand, know that by 1853, only a few years later, the colony of Vancouver Island only had 300 white inhabitants, which was dwarfed by the neighboring American Oregon Territory with 30,000 people. California, while a free state, was not hospitable towards black people, and they were made to endure injustices. In 1858, 2 bills were proposed in the state that encouraged the colored congregation of the Zion Methodist Episcopal Church to migrate to either Mexico or Vancouver Island, with 400 total moving to the island, especially after Governor Douglas stated that they could become British subjects with all their rights after 7 years. Akrigg writes that it was their misfortune that they arrived at the same time as thousands of gold-seeking Americans, which in 1858 were not amicable to them. Akrigg also writes that they were notably welcomed by the Reverend Mr. Cridge, an American on the island, disgusted by their presence in the church congregation alongside white people, wrote this open letter to the Reverend, stating, and I quote, "The sexton has repeatedly insulted our people by crowding Negro men into the same seats with white and respectable ladies. The Negro has his proper place among created beings. To make him our equal, he must submit to being skinned, renovated, born anew, or any other process of change to make him white." A reminder, if we really needed any, of the attitudes of the 1850s. But Reverend Cridge, in response, did send a letter to the Gazette, and I quote, repudiating such unchristian sentiments. These 3 excerpts offer a thin but human slice of early Vancouver Island as a colony. Despite the dire circumstances and sometimes depressing occurrences, there is a human element to this that I found very captivating while reading. Since Fort Victoria was a fairly small settlement at the time, many unique people pop up time and time again. I want to add that on January 14th, 1857, the town had an amateur play, and they even apologized for the delay brought on by their jobs, since the play was most likely meant for the New Year's. Here you can see both the apology and their duties in the British Columbia Chronicle. Thanks for watching.